Imagine this. You are Isolde, a girl barely 15 years old, standing at the threshold of a cold stone chamber in the spring of 1362. Outside, the valley of Caerwyn lies under a heavy shroud of mist, the damp air carrying the scent of thawing earth and wood smoke from distant cottages. Inside, the flicker of a few lone candles stretches long, trembling shadows across the rough-hewn walls, shadows that seem to watch you with silent anticipation. Approaching you is Lord Aldrich, your newly wedded husband, a man nearly twice your age. He was not chosen for you out of love, but because your father sought the power of 3 war horses and the rights to fertile land along the riverbank. The fabric of his cloak smells of ash and aged leather, each breath you take tinged with the weight of his presence. Your bare feet press against the icy stone floor, the cold biting into your skin as you step backward toward the bed, draped in a worn, heavy blanket. Through the thin timber walls, you can hear the muffled roar of voices, men drinking, laughing, their boots thudding against the floor, their mugs clashing like dull bells. They are waiting, not for silence, but for proof. Lord Aldrich's hand, hardened by years gripping the hilt of a sword, reaches for the leather cord at your throat, where a small charm, given by your mother, rests against your skin. You remember her voice that morning, low and urgent, offering warnings about what this night would bring. Yet standing here now, with the heat of his breath closing in, you realize no words could have prepared you for what lies ahead. This will not be the beginning of a love story. This will be the beginning of a struggle for survival in a world where a marriage bed belongs not to the two who share it, but to the unyielding laws, the honor of families, and the watchful eyes of a community that demands proof of possession. In Isolde's world, a wedding bed was never a sanctuary. It was a stage upon which religion, community, and ancient superstition all laid claim. Every touch, every whispered word between husband and wife was not simply an act of intimacy. It was a performance measured against the weight of law, the will of the church, and the survival of the household. What you are about to hear is not a tale of romance. It is a descent into the hidden chambers of medieval marriage and intimacy, a realm defined not by desire, but by duty, not by freedom, but by rules that would seem unimaginable to us now. Within these walls, superstition and theology dictated when, how, and even if a husband and wife could share their bodies. If you are drawn to uncovering the forgotten truths of history, truths that have been softened, rewritten, or entirely erased, stay with me. Tell me where you are listening from, so that across centuries and continents, we can stand together at the edge of this candlelit room, ready to step inside and witness what the world has long kept in the shadows. Because to understand what awaits Isolde tonight, we must first understand the vast network of beliefs, customs, and decrees that could turn the most private of acts into a battlefield of power, faith, and survival. In the year 1362, the rules of the marriage bed were written not in the hearts of those who lay in it, but in the scrolls and sermons of the church. Doctrine decreed that intimacy was permissible only under specific conditions, on certain days of the week, in certain seasons of the year, and in one single approved position, man above, woman below, face to face. Anything beyond this narrow allowance was condemned as sinful, unnatural, and dangerous to the soul. Theologians and priests held immense authority over the most private aspects of a couple's life. Figures like Pope Gregory IX and the renowned Abbess Hildegard of Bingen recorded detailed instructions their words spreading from cathedral pulpits to the ears of villagers who dared not question them. The rules were absolute. No intimacy during periods of fasting, holy days, pregnancy, menstruation, or breastfeeding. If a husband and wife obeyed every restriction, they might share a bed, in that way no more than 50 days in a year. Yet the regulation of intimacy did not end at the church door. On the night of a wedding, tradition demanded the bedding ceremony. Relatives and neighbors would escort the couple to their chamber, sometimes singing ribald songs, sometimes laughing, sometimes solemn. They would see them to the bed, undress them, and then wait, just outside, until sounds from within confirmed that the marriage had been sealed. For Isolde, this meant no escape from the pressure. She could hear the creak of boots shifting outside her chamber, the occasional cough, the scrape of a mug across a wooden table. They were not strangers. They were her husband's companions, her father's allies, her new household. And yet tonight, they were also witnesses, waiting for evidence that her body had been claimed and her worth proven. In the year 1362, the rules of the marriage bed were written not in the hearts of those who lay in it, but in the scrolls and sermons of the church. Doctrine decreed that intimacy was permissible only under specific conditions, on certain days of the week, in certain seasons of the year, and in one single, approved position. Man above, woman below, face to face. Anything beyond this narrow allowance was condemned as sinful, unnatural, and dangerous to the soul. Theologians and priests held immense authority over the most private aspects of a couple's life. Figures like Pope Gregory IX and the renowned abbess Hildegard of Bingen recorded detailed instructions, their words spreading from cathedral pulpits to the ears of villagers who dared not question them. The rules were absolute. No intimacy during periods of fasting, holy days, pregnancy, menstruation, or breastfeeding. If a husband and wife obeyed every restriction, they might share a bed, in that way, no more than 50 days in a year. Yet the regulation of intimacy did not end at the church door. On the night of a wedding, tradition demanded the bedding ceremony. Relatives and neighbors would escort the couple to their chamber, sometimes singing ribald songs, sometimes laughing, sometimes solemn. They would see them to the bed, undress them, and then wait, just outside, until sounds from within confirmed that the marriage had been sealed. For Isolde, this meant no escape from the pressure. She could hear the creak of boots shifting outside her chamber, the occasional cough, the scrape of a mug across a wooden table. They were not strangers. They were her husband's companions, her father's allies, her new household. And yet tonight, they were also witnesses, waiting for evidence that her body had been claimed and her worth proven. 1. Misunderstood medicine and the female body. In the learned halls of medieval Europe, the prevailing medical wisdom declared that women were imperfect versions of men. Physicians trained in universities, from Paris to Bologna, taught that the female body was an inversion of the male, its organs turned inward, its functions shaped by weakness. The womb was described as an inverted penis, the ovaries as internal testicles, their purpose defined solely by reproduction. These ideas were not merely harmless misunderstandings. They carried consequences that touched every moment of a woman's life. Learned men believed that a woman could not conceive unless she experienced pleasure equal to that of her husband, a belief that, when twisted, allowed courts to dismiss accusations of forced intimacy if pregnancy occurred. To the law, conception became proof not of violence, but of consent. Isolde had grown up hearing whispers from older women about the wandering womb, a terrifying affliction said to strike without warning. The womb, they believed, could drift upward to choke the heart, downward to slip away entirely, or coil itself in ways that caused madness and death. Remedies were as strange as the diagnosis. Sweet-smelling herbs burned beneath a woman's skirts to lure the womb back into place. Foul odors pressed to her nose to drive it downward. For the village women of Caerwyn, this knowledge was passed in low voices, often in the shadow of the forest or in the dim glow of the hearth. It was knowledge forbidden by the church, branded as superstition, and yet it survived because it was necessary. In a world where formal medicine dismissed women's suffering, folk cures and whispered rituals became the only shield they had against an invisible and ever-present threat. 2. Superstition and folk remedies. Beyond the reach of cathedral bells, in the deep forests and along the winding riverbanks, lay a network of beliefs that the church could not wholly erase. Women in Caerwyn, like their counterparts across medieval Europe, kept alive ancient practices, half medicine, half magic, that promised to guide fertility, prevent pregnancy, or ensure the birth of a strong son. Under the light of a full moon, they gathered plants with whispered incantations, choosing the moment carefully, for it was believed that a mistimed harvest would strip a herb of its power. Pennyroyal, tansy, and rue were brewed into bitter teas, said to prevent conception, though the line between an effective dose and a deadly one was perilously thin. A sprig of vervain worn against the skin was thought to encourage conception, while a mandrake root, its shape eerily human, was treasured as the most potent charm of all. In the markets, forged mandrakes carved from common roots were sold for high prices, passed from hand to hand like sacred relics. Officially, the church denounced such objects as tools of witchcraft. Yet even the most devout villagers might hide a charm beneath their clothing while crossing themselves in the pews. Faith and superstition existed side by side, each filling the gaps the other left behind. Isolde's mother, cautious yet pragmatic, had once tucked a small pouch of dried herbs into her daughter's wedding trunk, a silent token of protection. She never spoke of its purpose, for to name it aloud was to risk condemnation. But Isolde understood. In a land where childbirth claimed 1 in 3 women, and where a single scandal could destroy a life, such hidden knowledge could mean the difference between survival and ruin. 3. Beliefs about menstruation and the isolation of women. In Caerwyn, as in much of medieval Europe, a woman's monthly bleeding was viewed with deep suspicion, even fear. Menstrual blood was believed to carry a dangerous potency, a force capable of spoiling crops, souring wine, and sapping the strength from men who came too near. The writings of ancient scholars, still taught in universities, claimed it could dull a blade's edge or drive animals mad. These beliefs seeped into law, custom, and daily life, shaping how women were treated in their most vulnerable days. During this time, women were often barred from entering churches, handling food meant for others, or touching holy objects. In some villages, they were sent to small huts on the outskirts of the settlement until their bleeding ceased, a physical exile meant to protect the community from their supposed contamination. What was framed as piety was, in truth, isolation, an unspoken reminder of the shame attached to the female body. Physicians of the era, steeped in the theory of humors, warned that if menstrual blood was not properly expelled, it would corrupt the woman from within, causing fevers, madness, or death. Their cures were often more dangerous than the ailment. Bloodletting to balance the body, purging with harsh substances, or even prescribing intercourse under the belief that a man's seed could neutralize the poison in the blood. Yet away from the gaze of the clergy, women shared their own quiet remedies. They used moss, softened cloth, or strips of sheepskin for protection, and they marked the moon's cycles to anticipate their own. In the warm glow of hearthlight, mothers taught daughters how to brew teas that eased the cramps or regulated the flow. These exchanges of knowledge were acts of quiet defiance, keeping alive a tradition that offered care where the official world offered only suspicion and control. 4. The role of women and the power of men in marriage. In the barony of Caerwyn, marriage was rarely a matter of choice for women. It was a transaction, a weaving together of land, livestock, and alliances, with the bride herself serving as a token of exchange. A woman's worth was measured not in her voice or her will, but in the purity of her body and the alliances her marriage could secure. Once the vows were spoken, the law recognized her not as an individual, but as property, first of her father, then of her husband. The authority of a husband was absolute. He could command his wife's labor, her movements, and her body without fear of reprisal. In the eyes of both church and law, refusal was not an option. To deny a husband his conjugal rights was considered a sin, one that could damn a wife's soul. At the same time, the violence he used to enforce his will was not only legal, but often expected, framed as a necessary correction to a wife's disobedience. For Isolde, this meant that her survival depended on a delicate balance, obedience enough to avoid punishment, yet caution enough to protect herself from the dangers that obedience might bring. Around her, she had seen women bear the marks of this imbalance. A neighbor's bruised cheek dismissed as the cost of defiance, a cousin's silence masking the loss of a child after a forced night in the marriage bed. The church's teachings reinforced these dynamics. Priests spoke of the household as a kingdom, the husband its ruler, the wife his subject. To question this order was to challenge the divine plan. And so, women learned to negotiate their place within the narrow bounds allowed to them. Through silence, through small acts of resistance hidden in daily routines, and through the passing of quiet wisdom from one generation to the next. 5. Punishment and sexual control through the courts and the church. In medieval Caerwyn, the governance of the body did not end at the bedchamber door. It extended into the public square and the echoing halls of the church's courts. Sexual offenses were judged not as crimes against individuals, but as violations against property and honor. A wife's body belonged to her husband, a daughter's to her father. To harm or dishonor them was to injure the man who held their claim. Punishments were as inconsistent as they were cruel. A nobleman accused of forcing himself upon a peasant woman might pay a fine and walk away unscathed, while a peasant who laid hands on a noble woman could face torture or death. Adultery, too, was a crime heavily weighted against women. A husband could legally kill his wife if he caught her in the act, while his own affairs with servants or unmarried women were rarely questioned. The church's tribunals held their own brand of control. Allegations of sexual sin were dragged into the confessional, where priests probed for intimate details under the guise of spiritual guidance. In more serious cases, couples were summoned before ecclesiastical judges, questioned separately about the acts they had committed, the positions they had used, even the sensations they had felt. The intrusion was total, stripping away whatever privacy marriage might still have held. Public humiliation was a favored tool of discipline. Women convicted of sexual misconduct might be paraded through the marketplace in chains forced to wear shameful garments, or confined in cages so small they could neither stand nor lie down. Men, too, could face brutal sentences, castration for the gravest offences, followed by death. These spectacles served a purpose beyond punishment. They were warnings, a public reminder of the power the law and the church wielded over the most private aspects of life. For Isolde, these stories were not distant tales. They were the whispered cautionary lessons passed among women as they spun wool or drew water from the well. They knew that one accusation, one rumor, could summon the machinery of justice down upon them, and once set in motion, it was almost impossible to stop. 6. The hidden world. Brothels, affairs, and the Lord's first night. Beneath the rigid moral codes of Caerwyn lay an unspoken truth. Desire did not vanish simply because the church forbade it. In the shadows of the market streets and along the edges of the port towns, brothels operated with a strange duality, condemned from the pulpit, yet quietly licensed by secular authorities who saw profit in their existence. The women who worked there were required to live in designated quarters, wear distinctive clothing, and submit to regular inspections, their lives controlled as tightly as their trade. For the wealthy and the powerful, indulgence often came without consequence. Affairs between noblemen and their servants were so common that they rarely raised an eyebrow, provided they were discreet. Among the peasantry, secret trysts took place in the darkened corners of barns, in the shelter of hedgerows, or during festivals when watchful eyes were distracted by the chaos of celebration. Each meeting carried the risk of ruin, but also the lure of freedom, however brief. Then there was the most feared and whispered custom of all, the so-called rite of the first night. Legend claimed that a feudal lord could claim the bride of any man under his domain on her wedding night, taking her before her husband. Whether this was truly practiced or merely threatened, its shadow loomed over every marriage in the land. The mere suggestion of it was enough to remind every bride that her body was never fully her own. Isolde had heard the stories since childhood, tales of brides smuggled away in the night to avoid the Lord's summons, of grooms who offered bribes to ensure their new wives were left untouched. On the eve of her own wedding, the thought had haunted her, a silent fear she could not voice. Even now, in the dim light of her chamber, she knew that her safety depended not on law or mercy, but on the whims of the man who had claimed her. 7. Demons and sexual monsters in the beliefs of the age. In the medieval imagination, the dangers of the bedchamber were not confined to mortal flesh. The night was said to belong to beings older and darker than any human law, creatures that slipped between worlds to prey upon the vulnerable. The church taught that succubi and incubi were not mere superstition, but living threats, their existence documented in theological writings and whispered confessions. A succubus, the priests warned, took the form of a woman to seduce men, draining their vitality with each illicit encounter. Her male counterpart, the incubus, was said to force himself upon women in their sleep, leaving them weakened, cursed, or even pregnant with unnatural offspring. Learned men claimed these demons could change form at will, stealing seed from one victim, then transforming to pass it into another, ensuring the child would be born marked by evil. For women like Isolde, such beliefs blurred the line between the supernatural and the all-too-human dangers of the night. Sleep paralysis, now known as a quirk of the body, was then seen as proof of demonic visitation. A woman who woke in the dark, unable to move, her chest heavy with pressure, might be pitied, or accused of inviting the demon's touch. Fear gave rise to rituals meant to guard the threshold between the living and the damned. Crosses were carved into bedposts, protective charms were sewn into pillows, and prayers were spoken aloud before sleep to drive away shadowed intruders. But protection was never certain. Those who claimed to have been visited risked not only disbelief but accusation, for to admit such an encounter was to tread perilously close to the charge of witchcraft, a crime that could end in fire. For Isolde, these tales had always been part of the background hum of life in Caerwyn, stories to be shared at night when the fire was low. But here, in the candlelit confines of her wedding chamber, the boundary between myth and reality felt thin enough to tear. 8. Festivals and disguised sexual rites. Despite the church's relentless campaigns to impose restraint, certain times of the year loosened the grip of authority, if only for a night. In Caerwyn, as in many corners of medieval Europe, ancient fertility rites lingered beneath the surface of Christian festivals, cloaked in the language of holy celebration but rooted in older, earthbound traditions. May Day was the most notorious. At dusk, the young men and women of the village would slip away into the forest under the pretense of gathering flowers and green branches to adorn the church. In truth, the night became a realm of freedom, where whispered vows were exchanged in the shadows and desire was allowed to bloom without the scrutiny of elders. Songs drifted through the trees, mingling with laughter and the rustle of leaves underfoot. By dawn, couples returned with armfuls of blossoms and secrets that would never be spoken aloud. These rites were more than rebellion. They were bound to the survival of the community. A good harvest was linked, in the minds of many, to acts of fertility performed during these sacred nights. Grain was scattered over brides to ensure strong children. Beds were blessed with holy water and tucked with sprigs of rosemary to encourage conception, and charms were hidden beneath mattresses to ward off infertility. Isolde had seen such customs as a child, watching from behind her mother's skirts as newlyweds were showered with handfuls of wheat. Now, standing at the threshold of her own marriage, she felt the weight of those same expectations pressing down. This night was not merely about her and Lord Aldrich, it was about the future of his lands, the continuation of his name, and the unspoken belief that the health of the fields themselves might depend on her womb. The chamber was quiet now, the raucous laughter outside having ebbed into a muffled hum. The air inside felt heavier than the stone walls could explain, thick with the mingling scents of candle wax and damp wool. Isolde sat at the edge of the bed, the coarse blanket bunched beneath her hands, its roughness digging into her palms. Every sound seemed sharper. The groan of the wooden door as it shifted in its hinges, the low scrape of Lord Aldrich's boots across the floor. She knew the rules. She knew the weight of them as surely as she felt the press of the cold air against her skin. To refuse her husband was to risk his wrath, and the wrath of the law that stood behind him. To submit was to surrender, not only her body, but the fragile boundary she had fought to keep between herself and the life she had not chosen. Lord Aldrich approached without haste, as though the outcome were already decided. His shadow loomed over her, stretching long and uneven in the flickering light. He reached for her, and in that moment, every story she had ever heard, the cautions whispered by her mother, the tales of women punished for defiance, the murmurs of demons that came in the night, crowded into her mind like a gathering storm. Outside the chamber, unseen eyes waited for proof, a stain on the sheets, a cry overheard, any sign that the union had been sealed. For them, This night was an ending, a transaction completed, an alliance secured. For Isolde, it was a beginning of a life bound by laws she had not made, of a struggle to navigate the narrow path between survival and self. The candlelight caught in Lord Aldrich's eyes, reflecting something cold and certain. The door remained closed, the world beyond it, holding its breath. And in that suspended moment, Isolde understood that what would happen next would be carried with her for the rest of her days, not as a memory, but as a shadow that would shape every choice, every silence, every unspoken thought that followed. Centuries have passed since the night in Caerwind, when Isolde first sat beneath the weight of law, custom, and expectation. Yet the threads of her story still weave themselves through our modern world. The forms have changed, the language softened, but the core struggle, the right to ownership over one's own body, remains a battleground across cultures and continents. In Isolde's time, marriage was less a union of hearts than an arrangement of property, status, and survival. Today, while laws have shifted and freedoms expanded, echoes of that old order can still be heard. Women in many parts of the world still face marriages they did not choose, expectations they did not agree to, and systems of authority that hold the final say over their most private choices. The belief that intimacy is a right to be claimed rather than a trust to be earned has not vanished. It has only taken new shapes. The Church's iron grip on the marriage bed has loosened, yet the forces of culture, religion, and politics still seek to dictate who may touch, when, and how. The medieval fear of the female body, its cycles, its desires, its power, persists in subtler forms, shaping laws about reproductive rights, shaping debates about morality, shaping how societies measure a woman's worth. Looking back at Isolde's world does more than shock us with its strangeness. It forces us to confront the ways our own world mirrors it, to see the shadows of Caerwind in modern headlines, in whispered conversations, in the unspoken rules that still govern love and intimacy. The tools of control may have changed, but the instinct to control remains. And so, Isolde's story is not a relic, it is a lens. Through it, we can see how far we have come and how far we have yet to go. Her chamber, with its cold stone walls and flickering candlelight, is not just a place in the past. It is a reminder that the fight for autonomy, dignity, and safety is not bound by time. The candles in the chamber burn low, their flames bending in the faint draught that slips through the stone. Lord Aldrich's shadow still lingers against the wall, but now we see more than just the man. We see the weight of a culture, the centuries of doctrine and fear, the invisible chains of law and custom. And we see Isolde standing at the edge of a life she did not choose, yet carrying within her the quiet resilience that generations of women before her had passed down in whispers and glances. Her story is just one among countless others, lost to time. Stories of women and men whose lives were shaped by forces far beyond their control, whose private moments were never truly private. Yet in telling her story, we pull it from the shadows, refusing to let it fade into the silence that so often swallows the past. History is not only what happened, it is what we choose to remember and how we choose to tell it. By stepping into Isolde's world, we can better understand our own, and perhaps find the courage to challenge the invisible rules that still shape our lives. If you have ever wondered how much of the past still breathes in the present, or felt the weight of traditions whose roots stretch deeper than memory, I invite you to keep exploring with me. Share your thoughts, share where you are listening from, and let us connect across the vast distance of time. Together, we can uncover more stories like Isolde's, stories that remind us that the struggle for dignity, autonomy, and love is as old as humanity itself.